At the far western edge of the Sinisa Basin, where the shortgrass ran on for a day's ride without a fence to break it, there was one place the drought had not yet killed, and every wild thing in that country knew the road to it. The old people called it Ojo Frio, the cold eye, a spring that rose clear and steady out of a shelf of red rock at the foot of the Rincon Breaks and made a shallow pool no wider than a corral before the thirsty ground drank it back down again. In a wet year it was one water among many, and nobody gave it a thought. In the third dry summer, with the creeks gone to cracked clay and the stock tanks showing their bottoms like empty skillets, Ojo Frio was the whole difference between living and not, and the thing that came to drink there at the end of every day was the most beautiful sight left in the basin. They came down out of the breaks in the last hour of light, when the sun lay low and turned the whole prairie the color of poured brass. A wild band of Mustangs, 30-odd head, mares and their foals and the geldings that ran with them, coats dusted gold by the failing light, moving in that loose, unhurried line that only horses with no owner ever move in. And at the head of them, or more often a little apart and above them, on the lip of a rise where he could see the whole country at once, came the stallion. He was a grulla, a storm-gray stud the color of a thunderhead with the reins still in it, black on his legs and his muzzle, a black mane that lifted and fell like storm-rack in the wind off the breaks, and a dark stripe run clean down the length of his spine, as though the sky had drawn a line to mark him for its own. He would stand on that rise while the band watered, head up, testing the wind, and the low sun would come through the dust the band raised until horse and light and grass were all one burning thing. Then he would come down last and drink last, and lift his dripping muzzle, and take them back up into the breaks before the dark. There was a woman who watched them do this most evenings, from the shoulder of a dry wash a quarter-mile off, lying flat in the grass with her chin on her folded arms downwind, still as a fence post. She had watched them so many times that the sight no longer struck her as a picture. It struck her as a promise she did not yet know how to keep. Her name was Cora Halloran, and the brand on the failing outfit at her back was a diamond. The diamond, burned into what little stock she had left by her late father's own iron. She was a tall, sun-browned woman in a faded blue prairie dress, her dark hair pinned beneath a flat-brimmed hat, with level gray eyes that did not flinch. She had come out to the wash this evening the way she came most evenings, on foot and quiet, after the day's work was done and there was nothing left to do but count what could not be fixed. There was a good deal to count. The diamond lay 11 miles east of the spring, a low sod and log house, and a set of pole corrals, and a windmill that pumped rust more days than water. On land her grandfather had proved up, and her father had spent his life holding, and it was by every honest measure Cora could add, going under. Thomas Halloran had died 2 winters back, quiet, in the chair by the stove, with the ranch ledger open on his knee and the fire gone to coals before anyone found him. He had been a horseman before he was a cattleman, and a cattleman only because the country made him one, and he had raised the one heir he had the way he broke his colts, with patience and with time, and without ever once raising a hand he did not mean to keep raised. He left her the ground, the brand, the note at the bank in Sinisa, and a set of rules about horses she could have recited in her sleep. She had loved him past all sense, and she was learning, 2 winters on, that grief did not pay a note, and that a country in its 3rd dry year did not care whose father you had been proud of. The note was the thing that sat on her chest at night. Old Tom had borrowed against the place in the last good year to buy blooded studs and improve the horse herd, betting as he always bet on horses. Then the rains quit. The grass thinned to wire. The creeks failed one after another until only Ojo Frio still ran, and Ojo Frio lay on open range that the diamond used but did not own. Shared water in a country where water had become the only thing worth fighting over. Cora had sold cattle she could not keep alive to make the spring payment, and the sale had bought her one more season, and no more, and the fall payment stood in front of her now like a locked gate, with nothing on the far side of it. She had one man left. Bartolo Ruiz had ridden for her father for 30 years, and for her father's father before that. And when the last of the wage hands drifted off to outfits that could still pay in coin, Bart had simply not gone. He was a stove-up old vaquero with a silver-shot mustache, a coiled horsehair riata, and hands that could read a horse like scripture, and he took his pay now in beef and coffee and the right to die on ground he knew, and he considered the arrangement fair. It was Bart who had first shown her the wild band, 3 summers back, before the drought, riding the western line. It was Bart who had given the storm Gray Stallion the only name anyone had for him. El Grulo, he called him, the gray one, and he said it the way another man might say the name of a church. They lay in the wash together some evenings. The old man and the woman he had watched grow into her father's stubbornness, and they did not talk while the band watered, because Bart held that talk carried farther than a man thought, and that a wild horse forgave a great many things, but never a careless mouth. Only after the gray had taken the band back up into the breaks and the light had gone violet in the east would Bart allow himself a few low words. "He is the finest stud in this territory, and no man owns him," Bart said one such evening, and there was more pride in it than sorrow. "He is what your father spent his whole life trying to breed, and never quite caught." Cora had asked him what he meant by that, and the old man had only shrugged in the dark and said that some horses are born already knowing the thing you spend years trying to teach the rest, and that El Grulo had been born knowing it, and that it was a shame and a wonder both that such a horse should belong to nobody at all. What Cora did not say to Bart, because she had not yet found the shape of it in her own mind, was that she had begun to come to the wash less to study the band than to be near the one thing in her failing country that did not seem to be failing. Everything she owned was thinning. The cattle drew up gaunt at the tanks. The grass went to dust under a wind that never brought rain. The ledger's black column shrank, and its red column grew, and in the town of Siniza, the men who held her notes spoke to her now with the particular gentleness that men use on a thing they expect soon to be selling at auction. But the wild band came down out of the breaks fat and sound and shining, 30-odd head that answered to no bank and paid no note and drank the last free water in the basin, as though the drought were somebody else's rumor. The gray stallion stood on his rise against the burning sky, storm-colored, unbroken, unbought, and Cora Holleran lay in the grass and watched him, and felt something in her that the note and the drought and the 2 years of grief had not managed to put out. Her father had a saying for the country, one of 100, and it came to her now the way his sayings did, unbidden, in his voice. "Water's the only wealth out here," old Tom used to say, standing at the head of Ojo Frio with his hat pushed back. "Everything else is just dust waiting on a wind to blow it." She had thought it a hard old man's hard old joke when she was too green to know better. She understood it entirely now. She lay in the wash on the shoulder of the dry country, and she looked at the one live water for a day's ride in any direction, and at the wild horses grown sleek on it, and she felt the truth of the saying settle into her like cold spring water into cracked ground. She did not yet know that other men in the basin had come to understand it exactly as well as she had, and that they had already begun, in a lamplit room in town, to draw up their own arithmetic of the water, and that in their arithmetic the wild band that had come to mean so much to her was not a wonder at all, but a column to be crossed out. The first she heard of it came 4 days later, in Siniza, on an errand she could not put off. She rode in for flour and coffee and a talk with the bank she dreaded, and she left her horse at the public rack and walked the one dusty street with her chin up, the way her father had taught her to walk into a room she expected to lose in. Ceniza was a cattle town, a double row of false-fronted buildings around a plaza. The drought had turned the color of an old bone, and it lived and died on the big outfits the way a tick lives on a steer. The biggest of those outfits was the Ladder, and the Ladder's man was Harlan Rook, and Harlan Rook was the head of the Rincon Cattlemen's Association. And it was outside the association's meeting room, in the shade of the mercantile porch, that Cora first heard the word that would order the rest of her summer. Bounty. She heard it before she understood it. A knot of ranchers and hangers on around a paper freshly tacked to the mercantile wall, and a man reading it aloud for the benefit of those who could not, his finger under the words. The Rincon Cattlemen's Association, he read, hereby offers a bounty of $10 a head on all wild horses running the western range of the Ceniza Basin, said stock being declared vermin injurious to the range and a burden upon the water in this season of drought. Cora stopped on the edge of the porch with her flour sack forgotten on her hip, and read the notice twice with her own eyes to be sure the reading man had not embroidered it, and he had not. $10 a head. Vermin. A burden upon the water. And below the body of the notice, in a smaller hand, the part that stopped her breath, that the association had engaged a professional to see the work done. One Silas Creel, lately of the Wolf Country to the north, and that all riders were asked to give Mr. Creel the freedom of the range and their full cooperation until the western band was cleared. She stood very still on the porch in her faded blue prairie dress and felt the whole town rearrange itself around that piece of paper. The wild band was not a wonder to these men. It was a nuisance with a price on it. 30-odd head of the soundest horses in the territory, the gray stud that Bart spoke of like a church, the mares and their foals coming down gold through the evening light, all of it reduced on a tacked-up sheet to $10 a head and the word vermin, and a wolfer named Creel sent to collect. Somewhere at the back of the knot of men a rancher laughed and said it was about time, that the scrub had eaten grass his cattle needed, and another said the Mustangs fouled the only water left, and that a man could not run stock in a basin with 100 wild horses drinking it down. Cora opened her mouth to say that 30-odd horses drank less in a week than the latter's cattle drank in a day, that the band had watered at Ojo Frio for longer than any brand in the basin, that her father had called them the finest blood in the country and meant it. Then she closed her mouth again, because she had learned in 2 years of walking into rooms she expected to lose in, that a woman who argues before she understands the game has already lost it, and she did not yet understand this game at all. She understood only that it had a wolfer in it, and a bounty, and the last free water in the basin, and that the beautiful thing she lay in the grass to watch had just been ordered dead. The Bank of Ceniza was a brick front among the false ones, the only building in town that had put its money where the drought could not blow it away, and the man behind the desk was a careful, sorrowful man named Pettibone who had liked her father and did not enjoy his work. He let her sit, he turned her account toward her on the desk, and let her read the numbers herself, which was a courtesy, and the numbers said what she already knew. The fall payment was near, and she did not have it, and there was no honest way to pretend otherwise. Pettibone folded his hands and told her, in the gentle voice, that he was not without sympathy, that the drought had put half the small outfits in the basin in the same chair she sat in, and that a party had expressed interest in the diamond's ground, and might make an offer generous enough to clear the note and leave her something to start over on. Somewhere the water still ran. He did not say the party's name. He did not have to. There was only one outfit in the basin buying ground in the third dry summer. Only one man with coin loose enough to be generous about it, and Cora had passed his association's bounty notice tacked to the mercantile wall not 10 minutes before. She asked Pettibone straight out if the interested party was Harlan Rook, and the careful man's silence was answer enough. She thanked him for the courtesy of the numbers, told him she would make her payment, and rose before he could see whether she believed it. At the door she stopped and asked him one more thing, because a question had begun to work in her on the walk over and would not let her be. She asked him whether the latter had lately filed on any water in the Western Basin. Pettibone's face did a small, careful thing then, a tightening around the eyes, the look of a man who knows a thing he has been asked not to know aloud, and he said only that the land office kept its own records, and that they were open to any citizen who cared to ride to the territorial seat and read them. It was not a yes, it was a long way from a no. Cora carried it out into the white noon light and turned it over the way she turned over everything now, looking for the shape of the trouble underneath. And she was still turning it when a shadow crossed her, and a smooth voice spoke her father's name like a man laying down a card he knows will take the trick. Thomas Halloran's heir. Harlan Rook stood in the middle of the walk with the sun behind him, and he was exactly what a lifetime of getting his way had made him. A heavy, well-fed cattleman in a fine broadcloth coat with a gold watch chain across his belly and a voice used to being obeyed. He had a way of standing that took up more of the walk than one man's share, and a way of smiling that never reached the flat, assessing eyes above it, and he looked at Cora Halloran the way he looked at a piece of ground or a head of stock, adding her up, deciding what she was worth to him and what it would cost to get it. He was sorry about her father, he said, and did not sound it. He allowed that old Tom had been a fine horseman, which in Rook's mouth was the sort of praise a man gives a thing that is finished. Then he came to it, because Harlan Rook did not waste words on the dead when there was a living deal to be closed. He understood the diamond was pressed. He understood a woman alone could not be expected to hold a hard outfit through a drought that was breaking men twice her size. He was prepared, out of respect for her father's memory, to take the ground off her hands at a price that would clear her note and spare her the shame of the auction block, and he advised her, kindly, cattleman to orphan, to take it before the fall payment made the offer charity instead of a deal. Cora let him finish, because her father had also taught her that you learn more from a man who thinks he is winning than from one who thinks he must fight, and Harlan Rook plainly thought he was winning. When he was done, she asked him, in a voice as level as her eyes, why a man with all the deeded water on the ladder wanted a stretch of dry diamond grass badly enough to be generous about it in a drought. It was a small question, and it landed like a stone in a still tank. Something moved behind Rook's smile, quick and gone. The flicker of a man who has been asked the one thing he did not expect from a party he had already counted as beaten. Then the smile smoothed back over it, and he said that a cattleman always wanted more grass, that it was the nature of the business, and that she would understand these things better when she had failed at them a while longer. He touched his hat brim in a way that was more insult than courtesy, and moved on down the walk, taking up more than his share of it, and Cora stood in the sun and understood two things she had not understood that morning. Harlan Rook wanted her ground, and Harlan Rook did not want it for the grass. The wolfer she met by accident, or by the kind of accident a small town arranges, at the public rack where her horse stood hip-shot in the heat. He was seeing to a rangy dun of his own, a horse with a hard mouth and a wary eye, and Cora knew who he was before she read it on him, the way you know a coiled thing in the grass before you can name it. Silas Creel was a raw-boned mustanger with a wolfer's flat pale eyes, a tobacco-stained gray mustache, and a rifle scabbard worn to a shine, and he moved around his horse with an economy that told her, against every wish she had, that he was good at what he did. There was no cruelty in him that she could see, which somehow was worse. Cruelty she could have argued with. What Creel had instead was a workman's indifference, the flat calm of a man for whom horses had long ago stopped being wonders and become only a job of work with a wage attached, and that calm was harder to stand near than any rage. He knew her too, or knew of her, the woman who ran the pressed diamond and lay in the grass to watch the Western band, for the town had already made her that woman. He nodded to her, civil enough, and said he understood she knew the Western country better than most, and asked, plain as a man asking directions, whether the wild bunch watered anywhere but the cold spring in this dry a year. It was a professional's question, asked without heat, and it turned Cora's blood to river ice, because she saw all at once the whole shape of what the question meant. A man clearing a range of horses $10 a head had to catch them or run them off, and catching or running 30-odd wild head across a day's ride of broken country was long, hard, uncertain work that might take a wolfer all summer and still leave half the band alive in the breaks. But a man who knew the one water they could not live without in a drought did not have to catch them at all. He only had to reach the water first. Cora looked into Silas Creel's flat, pale eyes and understood that the bounty notice on the mercantile wall, with its $10 a head and its talk of clearing the range, was the polite version, the version for the porch and the paper, and that the real work had a shorter and a quieter method, and that the method was standing in front of her asking where else the horses drank. She told him they watered a dozen places, which was a lie, and that the Western country was full of seeps and tanks a stranger would never find. Which was a larger lie, and she told the lies with her father's steady face on, the face he wore at cards. And she could not tell from Creel's flat eyes whether he believed her or simply filed the lie away as one more piece of the country to be checked against the truth later. He thanked her without warmth, gathered his hard mouth done, and rode out the north end of the street toward the wolf country he had come from, and Cora stood at the rack a long moment, with her hand on her own horse's warm neck, steadying herself against a thing she now knew and wished she did not. They did not mean to run the band. They meant to poison the spring. $10 a head was the story. The water was the plan. And the last free water in the basin, the cold eye that had kept the wild horses fat and sound through 3 killing years, was about to be turned from the one thing that was saving them into the one thing that would finish them, unless somebody stood between the horses and the water, and there was nobody in the whole basin to stand there but a pressed woman in a faded blue dress that half the county was already waiting to see sold off at auction. She rode home through the long gold end of the day, with the whole thing turning in her, and she came over the last rise above the diamond, in the hour she loved best, when the low sun laid the ranch out in bronze and forgiving light and made the sagging outfit look, for an hour, like the place it had been when her father was alive to hold it up. Bart was at the corrals doctoring a colt's cracked hoof, and he read her face before she was out of the saddle, the way he read everything, and he set down the hoof and waited. She told him all of it standing at the corral rail, with the reins in her hand, the bounty and the $10 a head, and the word vermin. Rook's generous offer, and his flicker when she asked about the water, Pettibone's careful silence about a filing at the land office, and last of all Creel and his flat professional question at the rack. She watched the old vaquero take it in piece by piece, and she watched the thing settle on him that had settled on her at the rack, the understanding of what the wolfer's question meant. And Bart Ruiz, who did not curse in front of women out of a courtesy 30 years old, turned and spat into the dust and said one word in his own tongue that Cora did not need translated. They stood at the rail as the light went, and the first stars pricked out cold and far, and Bart said the thing plainly the way old men say the plain thing that the situation is built on. If they foul the cold spring, he said, they do not only finish the horses, they finish this basin. Every small outfit west of Ceniza waters stock at Ojo Frio or off the seeps it feeds, and poison in the head of that water runs down through all of it. The diamond's cattle, the diamond's horses, the diamond's ground, which is worth nothing at all without a water to work it. Cora had followed him there already, but hearing the old man lay it out in the dark made it solid, made it a thing with weight she could pick up and carry. Rook did not want her grass. Rook wanted her ground broken, her water gone, her note called, her outfit and every outfit like it swept off the western basin cheap, and the wild band with its bounty and its convenient reputation as vermin was only the cover story. The reason a man could give on a porch for poisoning a spring that half the county's living depended on. Kill the horses, blame the horses, break the small outfits when the water goes bad, and buy the whole western basin for the price of clearing vermin. It was, Cora thought, standing in the dark at her father's corral, a beautiful plan, if a man had no love for anything but arithmetic. And there was only one flaw in it that she could find. One loose thread hanging off the clean edge of it. And the flaw was that Harlan Rook had drawn up his whole clever scheme without ever once considering that the pressed woman he meant to buy out cheap might decide, instead, to fight. She did not decide to fight all at once, the way it is told afterward. She decided it in pieces, over the days that followed, the way a person decides most of the large things in a life. By finding one morning that the deciding is already done and only the doing is left. She lay awake the first night, doing the honest arithmetic her father had raised her to do, and the arithmetic said plainly that she had no standing, no coin, no men, and no law she could point to. Ojo Frio sat on open range. The band belonged to nobody. The association's bounty was legal on its face, and there was no statute in the territory that made it a crime to foul a water a woman did not own to save the horses a woman had no claim on. By every rule of the country she had been handed, this was not her fight, and a sensible woman one payment from the auction block would keep her head down, take Rook's offer while it was still an offer, and start over somewhere the water still ran. But her father had raised her by more rules than the ones the country handed out, and toward morning the other rules began to answer the arithmetic. He had told her, more times than she could count, that a person's whole worth in a hard country came down to what they would stand in front of. Any man will stand in front of a thing that is his, old Tom said. It takes a better one to stand in front of a thing that is only right. He had stood in front of things all his life that were not his. Sick neighbors, lost travelers, a orphaned colt nobody wanted, and he had died land poor and note-burdened and, Cora understood now in the gray light before dawn, entirely unbeaten. Because a man cannot be beaten out of a thing he never measured by whether it paid. She lay in the dark of the sod house and looked at the low ceiling her father had laid up with his own hands, and she thought about the gray stallion standing storm colored against the burning sky, unbroken and unbought, and about the mares and their foals coming down gold through the evening, and about the flat pale eyes of the wolfer asking where else they drank. Somewhere in there the deciding finished itself. When she rose and built up the fire and went out into the first light to start the day's work, she was no longer a woman wondering whether to fight. She was only a woman who had not yet worked out how. The how began, as most things on the diamond began, with Bart and with horses. If she meant to keep the band off the spring when the poison came, she could not do it by lying in a wash a quarter-mile off and hoping. She would have to be able to move them, to turn them, to put herself where they were, and have them suffer her nearness. And 30-odd wild head, led by the wariest stud in the territory, would sooner run to the next county than let a walking human inside a rifle shot. There was only one road into a wild band, Bart said. And it was the long, slow road, the one her father had walked with every colt he ever gentled, and it went at the pace the horse set, and not one step faster. You do not have the summer for it, the old man warned her, sitting his horse at the western line the first morning they rode out to begin. And Cora had answered him with her father's own words, because they were the truest thing she owned. "You don't break a horse," she said. "You make it a promise, and you keep it. And a promise doesn't ask how much time it has." So she began to keep a promise the band had not asked for, and did not know it was being made. Every evening in the last hour of light, she rode out to the western country and let herself be seen. That was all, at the start. She did not approach. She sat her horse at a distance the band would tolerate, well back downwind, and she let them water and graze and drift while she did nothing at all but be there, a shape on the prairie that did no harm. And every evening she moved that distance in by a length or two, so slowly that the horses could not find the moment to be afraid of. Bart rode with her the first weeks, and then, when he saw she had the patience for it, began to let her go alone, because a wild band would suffer one still human sooner than two. She learned the band the way you learn a family. She learned the lead mare, a hard old blue roan with a notched ear, who decided when the band moved and where, and who watched Cora with a flat, suspicious eye long after the others had stopped bothering. She learned the geldings and the mares and the three foals of that year, leggy and curious, and forever being called back from their curiosity by the roan. And she learned the gray. The gray was the hardest and the last. El Grulo did not graze easy while a human sat the prairie the way the others learned to. He kept himself between Cora and his band, always, a storm-colored wall of muscle and watchfulness. And he did not lower his head to the water until she had proven, evening on evening, that she would do nothing while he drank. He was, Bart said, the smartest horse he had known in 70 years of knowing horses, and the smart ones were the slow ones to gentle. Because a smart horse does not spook at a shape and forget it. A smart horse remembers, weighs, tests, and grants its trust the way a hard man grants a loan, in small amounts against proven security. Cora set out to prove herself secure. She gave the gray no reason, evening after evening, week after week, to change his estimate of her, and slowly, so slowly she could not have named the day it began, the estimate changed anyway. There came an evening when he drank while she sat 100 feet off, instead of watching her the whole while. There came an evening when he grazed with his tail to her. There came an evening, deep in the summer, when the lead mare moved the band down to the water and the gray, instead of placing himself between, simply let Cora be inside the loose edge of them. One more shape on the darkening prairie, tolerated, and she sat her horse in the middle of a wild band at golden hour, with her heart going like a hammer, and did not move so much as a finger, and understood that she had been let in. She learned, in those weeks, the thing her father had meant all her life, and she had never fully caught until she was doing it herself with everything she owned riding on it. Gentling was not a technique. It was a conversation conducted almost entirely in stillness, and the only thing a person had to offer in it was the steady daily proof that they were not the thing the horse feared. Everything in the wild band's blood said that a walking human was a wolf that stood up, a thing that meant ropes and fire irons and the end of the free country, and Cora's whole task was to be, patiently and without exception, the one human who was none of that. She carried no rope where they could see it. She never rode at them, never crowded, never took by a foot of ground more than they gave. She talked to them low and constant in the gentling voice her father had used, a voice with no words that mattered in it, only the steady grain of the sound, and she offered, when at last she was close enough to offer anything, the thing her father had taught her to offer first and always, an open hand. The raised open hand was the whole of her father's method, distilled. Not a hand with a rope in it, or a bit, or a bribe, though the bribe came later. Just the open hand, lifted slow and held still at the end of a still-arm palm bear, offering nothing and asking nothing. A shape that said as plainly as a shape can say anything, that there was nothing hidden and nothing meant. A horse comes to an open hand when it is ready, and not before, her father had told her. and your whole job is to have the hand there, open, on the day it is ready, and to have never once given it a reason to be sorry it looked. Cora raised that hand to the wild band 100 times before any horse in it did more than flick an ear at the strangeness of it. And then, on an evening in the deep of the summer, gold light pouring level across the grass, and the band drowsing at the water, the leggiest of the year's foals, a dun colt with its mother's notched ear, walked on stiff, curious legs across the last 20 feet of forbidden ground, and put its whiskered muzzle against Cora Halloran's open palm, and blew, and stood there trembling with its own daring, and the whole wild band watched, and the gray stallion watched hardest of all. And something passed over the western country in that moment that no bounty notice tacked to a wall could ever price. She wept a little, sitting her horse with the foal's muzzle in her hand, and she was not ashamed of it, because there was no one to see but horses, and horses do not count a person's tears against them. She wept for the plain wonder of the thing, and she wept because she understood, holding that trembling foal's trust in her open hand, exactly what it was that Silas Creel had been hired to end, and Harlan Rook had been willing to poison a basin to be rid of. Not vermin, not a burden on the water. This, the oldest free thing left in the country, the last of it, come down at the end of every day to the last free water, granting its trust one trembling foal at a time to the one human who had promised it nothing, and asked it nothing, and simply, day on day, refused to be the wolf. She rode home in the dark with her face wet and her jaw set, and Bart, who had watched the whole of it from the far rise through her father's old field glasses, met her at the corral without a word, and put his stove up hand on her shoulder, the way he had done the night her father died, and they stood there a while in the dark, the old vaquero and the woman. And then Bart said the only thing there was to say. "Now," he said, "we had better find out how to keep them alive." The keeping of them became the secret architecture of Cora's days, and she built 2 lives to hold it. There was the life the basin could see, a pressed woman working a failing outfit down to its bones, and there was the life she rode out to at evening, and the first existed mostly to guard the second. She was up before light every morning to the work the drought made brutal, hauling water to the gaunt cattle at the failing tanks, pulling weak stock out of the drying mud, doctoring and mending and stretching a dwindling store of everything across a lengthening want. Bart worked beside her at all of it, the 2 of them and a handful of saddle horses holding 140 sections of dying grass against a season that meant to take it. She sold another bunch of cattle that month because there was no water to carry them, and she watched them go down the road to the railhead in another outfit's dust. And she did the arithmetic afterward at the kitchen table, and found it still came up short of the fall note by a distance she could not ride. There were nights she came near to quitting, and she did not pretend otherwise to herself, because her father had taught her that a person who lies to their own self keeps the poorest books of all. She would sit with the ledger and the guttering lamp, and the whole weight of it would settle on her. The note and the drought and the wolfer, and the powerful smiling man who wanted her ground. And the plain sense of the country would speak up in her father's own reasonable voice and tell her to take Rook's offer while it stood, to clear the note and start clean somewhere the water still ran, to let the wild band be the government's business or nobody's, and to save herself. It was good advice. It was the advice she would have given a stranger. And every time she had almost taken it, she would bank the fire and step out into the dark to look at the western breaks where the band bedded down under the cold stars. And she would feel the foal's whiskered muzzle against her open palm all over again, and the advice would go quiet. Because some things a person knows below the level where advice reaches. And Cora knew that a woman who saved herself by standing aside from that would be saving the wrong thing and losing the one that mattered. She learned the timeline was closing on a flour and coffee errand into Sinisa, the way she learned most hard things, sideways, by keeping her mouth shut and her ears open in a country that did not trouble to lower its voice around a woman it had already counted out. She was loading her sacks at the mercantile when two of the association's middling men came onto the porch talking, easy and unguarded, and she heard the shape of the thing in the space of a minute. Rook wanted it done before the fall roundup, they said, done and settled, and the range cleared while the drought still gave him his reason, because a reason like a drought does not keep, and a wet year would ruin the whole argument for it. The wolfer was near ready. He had found the ground he wanted at the cold spring. It would be soon. Cora tied her sacks with steady hands and carried them out to her horse, and did not let one thing show on her face, and she rode out of town at a walk until the last building was behind her, and then she let the horse run, because she had to move or fly apart, and the wind of it dried the water off her face before it fell. Soon she had thought she had the summer. She had a piece of it, and no more, and the piece was shrinking while she counted it. That was the night the two fights came clear to her, as two and not one, sitting up late with Bart and the bad coffee and the map of the western country her father had drawn on the back of a feed bill years before. She saw that she had been thinking of it all as a single problem, saving the band, and that it was really two problems wearing one coat, and that if she did not separate them, she would lose both. There was the near fight, the fight of the body and the water and the day the poison came, the fight of standing between the horses and the spring. And there was the far fight, the fight of the paper and the truth and the powerful man behind it all. The fight that had to be won in the daylight of the plaza or the courtroom, or it would not stay won at all. She could give her whole self to the near fight, and stand at that spring like a rock, and turn the band for a night or a week, and still lose everything the moment she was arrested, or worn down, or simply outlasted, because the far fight would go on without her, and the paper would win it. Both then, she would have to fight both, the near one with her body and the far one with the truth, and she would have to fit them together so tightly that the winning of the one delivered the winning of the other. And she did not yet see how, but she saw that it was the shape the summer would have to take, and she went to bed that night with the shape of it and rose the next morning to begin the far fight. Because the far fight, she had realized, ran through a low busy building 3 days east, in the public records that even Harlan Rook could not keep her from reading. Keeping them alive meant 2 fights at once, and Cora had the sense to see it early. There was the fight at the spring, the one she was training her body and the band's trust to be ready for, the fight of standing between the horses and the poison on the day it came. But there was a second fight, quieter and further off, and it was the one that would decide the first. A woman could stand at a spring with her arms out and turn a band of horses for a night or a week, but she could not stand there forever, and the moment she failed or faltered, or was simply arrested for interfering with a lawful bounty, the poison would go in the water, and the thing would be done. The only way to truly save the band was to break the story the poison hid behind, to drag the real plan out of the lamplit room and into the daylight where the honest men of the basin could see it, and to do that she needed proof, and Pettibone the banker had told her in his careful way exactly where the proof was kept. The land office kept its own records. They were open to any citizen who cared to ride to the territorial seat and read them. So she rode to the territorial seat, 3 days there and 3 days back, on the errand she could least afford in the season she could least spare, and she went because everything else depended on it. She left Bart to hold the diamond and to ride the western line at evening in her place, close enough to see if anything moved on the spring, and far enough not to undo a summer's patient work, and she took the flat-bottomed road east across the drought-struck basin with a bedroll and a sack of corn and her father's field glasses, and she thought the whole long way about what a land record could and could not tell her. The territorial seat was a raw, ambitious town, 3 times the size of Ceniza, built on a railhead and a courthouse, and the traffic of a country still being carved into deeds. And the land office was a low, busy building where clerks moved between tall shelves of ledgers and rolled plats, filing the slow legal conquest of the country, one entry at a time. Cora washed the road off her face, put on the steady card-playing look, and told the clerk at the counter that she wished to examine the water filings for the western Ceniza Basin, township and range, for the past 2 years. It was, she had learned, the great secret weapon of the powerless in a country of paper. The records were public, and a clerk who would never have let a pressed woman into a cattleman's meeting was obliged by law to lay the cattleman's filings open on the counter in front of her for the asking. It took the clerk the better part of an afternoon to bring up all of it, and it took Cora past dark, by lamp, to read it, and when she had read it, she sat very still with the ledger open in front of her, and felt the whole clever shape of the thing come clear at last, cold and complete, like a landscape when the fog lifts off it. Harlan Rook had filed on the water at Ojo Frio. Not on the ground around it, which was open range no man could easily claim, but on the water itself, under a territorial statute meant to let a rancher secure a spring he had developed and improved for stock. The filing claimed that the latter outfit had improved the cold spring, had cleaned and boxed and protected it for the watering of stock, and it asserted, on that basis, a prior right to the water superior to any other user in the basin. It was dated in the spring, months back, long before the bounty notice, long before the word vermin was ever tacked to the mercantile wall. And reading the date, Cora understood the true order of the thing, which was the reverse of the story everyone in Ceniza believed. The town believed the horses had become a problem, and the bounty was the answer. The truth was that Rook had wanted the water first, had filed to secure it in secret months before, and had then needed a reason the whole basin would accept for why the last free spring in a drought should pass out of common use and into one man's control. The wild band was not the problem the water claim answered. The wild band was the excuse the water claim required. There was more, and the more was the part that would have turned an honest county inside out if an honest county had ever been shown it. Folded into the same file, in a later hand, was a petition to the Territorial Stock Board over Rook's signature as association head, requesting that the western band be officially declared feral vermin injurious to the range, and requesting further that the association be authorized to abate the nuisance by whatever means its engaged agent deemed effective, including, the petition said in the flat legal words that made Cora's hands go cold on the ledger, the treatment of shared waters to discourage the congregation of feral stock. The treatment of shared waters. There it was, on file, in a government office, in Harlan Rook's own hand, months in advance, the legal permission to put poison in Ojo Frio, dressed in language so bloodless that the clerk who filed it had likely never once pictured what it meant. A basin's worth of horses and cattle and every wild thing that drank there, and a plan to blame every drop of it on the horses that had been declared vermin for exactly this purpose. Cora copied it all out that night by lamp, word for word, the water filing and the petition and every date, in a clerk's fair hand her father had made sure she owned, and she had the copies witnessed and stamped by the office the next morning as true copies of the public record, and she rode back west across the basin carrying in her saddlebag the whole clever murder of the plan written out in the murderer's own words. She understood that the papers alone would not save the band. Rook was powerful, and the papers were legal on their face, and a woman could wave true copies of a public record in the Ceniza Plaza until she was hoarse and changed nothing, if she had no one withstanding, and no one with an eye for a horse, and no moment sharp enough to make the honest men of the basin actually look. But she had the truth now, entire and provable. And truth was a thing you could build on, and she began, on the long road home, to build. She came back to a country that had grown teeth while she was gone. Bart met her at the western line at dusk with his rifle across his saddlebow, which he had not carried since the spring, and his face told her the rest before he spoke. Creel had been on the spring. Twice that Bart had seen, riding the head of Ojo Frio slow on his hard-mouthed dun, studying the lay of the rock and the run of the water down into the seeps, the way a man studies a thing he means to work on. He had not done anything yet. He was doing what a careful workman does before a job, learning the ground and the careful. Unhurried patience of it frightened Bart more than haste would have. Twice, too, ladder riders had crossed onto the Diamond's used range on errands they did not explain, drifting the western country, and once one of them had sat his horse on the far rise at evening and watched Cora's empty watching place through a glass of his own. So that the summer's long secret work with the band was a secret no longer, and the whole western basin knew now that the pressed woman from the Diamond had made herself somehow the keeper of the horses the association had ordered cleared. It made her a problem to be solved, Bart said, the same as the horses, and he did not like the look of how fast she had become one. Cora took the rifle from him and looked at the last gold light dying off the breaks where the band would be bedding down, and she felt the shape of the summer narrow to its point. The papers were in her saddlebag. The poison was somewhere in the future, close now, days or a week or two. And between the two lay the last thing she had to do before she could fight for the band in the daylight of the plaza, the thing she had spent all summer walking toward one length at a time. The thing that had waited at the center of it all along. She had to finish gentling the gray. Not because a gentled stallion would change a water filing or answer a petition to the stock board, but because Cora had begun to understand, in the way you understand a thing before you can prove it, that the storm gray stud was the center of this, that the band followed him and lived by him and would go where he went, and that if it ever came to standing between the horses and the poison, she could not turn 30-odd wild head with her arms out unless the one they all watched had learned to. Watch her back. And beyond the cold sense of it there was the other thing, the thing she did not say even to Bart, which was that she had fallen the way you fall for a country or a calling, wholly and without hope of undoing it, for the wild, proud, storm-colored horse that belonged to nobody, and that she wanted, before whatever came. To have stood close enough once to lay her open hand against his neck and have him allow it. So on the first cold evening after her return, with the papers safe and the threat closing, and the whole basin watching the western country now, Cora Halloran rode out alone to the wild band, and left her horse ground tied at the edge of the tolerated distance, and walked the last of the forbidden ground on foot, slow, downwind, talking low, her open hand raised at the end of her still arm, toward the gray stallion who stood storm-colored against the burning sky, and, for the first time in a summer of patience, did not move away. The last 20 feet took her the better part of an hour, and she would not have traded it for the deed to the whole basin. She moved the way water moves toward low ground, so slow the eye could not catch the moment of it, and she talked the whole time in the wordless, gentling voice, and the gray stood and let her come. His ears worked forward and back, reading her, and his great dark eye held her the whole way, and once he swung his head and blew a hard warning breath that stopped her cold for 10 full minutes before she dared lift her foot again, and still he did not leave. The band grazed uneasy at the water below, the notch-eared roan flinging up her head to watch. But the gray had made his decision, and a band takes its fear from its stud, and so long as he stood they held. Cora came the last length, with her heart slamming so hard she thought he must hear it, and her raised hand crossed the final foot of air that had taken her a summer to earn, and she laid her open palm, at last, flat against the storm-gray neck of the wild stallion, and he flinched under it like water struck, and did not run. He was warm. That was the thing that undid her, the plain animal warmth of him under her hand, the life running huge and quick beneath the storm-colored hide, the thing the bounty notice had priced at $10. She stood with her palm flat on his neck and felt his pulse go and his breath heave, and the tremor of his held wildness run up her arm. And she kept the voice going, low and steady, and after a moment the tremor eased, and he let a breath out long through his nose, and the great muscles under her hand loosened by a degree. And Cora Halloran, who had not let herself cry more than twice since her father died, stood in the middle of a wild band at golden hour, with her hand on the neck of the finest horse in the territory, and shook with the effort of not making a sound that might break the thing she had spent a summer building. She moved her hand along his neck, slow, the way her father had taught her, letting him learn the feel of a human touch that wanted nothing, up the crest under the storm-rack mane and down over the great sloped shoulder. And it was there, on the point of the shoulder where the summer coat lay thin over the muscle, that her fingers found the thing that stopped the whole world. A ridge under the hair, a line of old scar, healed hard and grown over with years of wild living, but a shape her fingers knew before her mind would let itself know it, because she had run her hand over that exact shape 10,000 times in her life, on the necks and hips of every horse the diamond had ever raised. Her fingers read it in the failing light the way a blind person reads a face. A diamond, her father's iron, burned into the point of this wild stallion's shoulder in a year long gone, healed and haired over and hidden under the storm gray coat, but there, unmistakable, a diamond brand on a horse the Rincon Cattlemen's Association had declared feral vermin born wild to the range. Cora stood with her fingers on the old scar and felt the ground tilt under her, and the gray turned his great head and looked at her down the length of his own body with his dark wild eye. And she looked back at him, and the thing she had been circling all summer without letting herself see it came up out of the deep water of her and broke the surface with his name on it. Smoke, she said it aloud, softly, the first word with meaning she had spoken to him all summer, and the gray flicked his ear at the sound the way a horse flicks its ear at a thing half remembered from another life. Smoke, it could not be, and it was. 5 winters gone, the year Cora was still learning the western country at her father's stirrup. Thomas Halloran had raised a gray colt out of his best-blooded mare and the tough Spanish stud he had mortgaged the place to buy, and he had called the colt Smoke for the storm color of him, and he had said, in the plain way he said the truest things, that this one was the horse he had been trying to breed his whole life, the one that came already knowing. He had loved that colt past sense, the way Cora had come to love the wild gray, without letting herself know why. And in the killing blizzard of that 5th winter gone, the great 3-day storm that had drifted the basin fence deep and scattered stock from here to the territorial line, the gray colt had broken out of the diamond corrals with a bunch of panicked horses and gone before the wind into the white, and when the storm cleared and the country could be ridden again, the others had drifted home or been gathered, but the gray colt was never found. Her father had ridden the western breaks for a month looking. He had never spoken of giving up. He had simply, one spring day, stopped saddling to go look, and Cora had understood that the looking was over, and the colt was counted lost, and neither of them had said the horse's name again, because some losses a family keeps by not naming them. He had not died in the blizzard. That was the whole of the twist that stood revealed under Cora's shaking hand in the gold light. The gray colt had run west before the storm and lived, had found the wild band or made one, had grown from her father's lost colt into the storm gray stud that ruled the western basin, and had been, all this time, all 5 winters, running free not 20 miles from the corral he was foaled in, carrying the diamond iron under his wild coat, siring foals on the Mustang mares that were half his own blood, building out of a lost horse and a wild band the very thing Thomas Halloran had spent his life and his mortgage trying to breed, and had died believing he had failed to catch. He had not failed. He had bred it and lost it to a storm, and it had gone on breeding itself in the free country while he grieved it dead. The band the association called Worthless Vermin was not worthless and was not truly wild. It was diamond blood run free, the soundest, toughest, best-footed horses in the territory, precisely because they carried the blood old Tom had mortgaged everything to bring in. And the gray stud at the head of them was her father's last living work, the great horse of his life, standing storm-colored and unbroken against the burning western sky, with the family iron heeled into his shoulder. Cora rode home in the full dark that night, not weeping, but changed, carrying the thing the way you carry a weight that has settled your feet more firmly on the ground, instead of dragging them down. She told Bart in the lamplight of the sod house, the papers from the land office spread on the table between them, and she watched the old vaquero's face go through the same country hers had gone through. Disbelief, and then memory, and then a slow, stunned certainty. And when she told him about the diamond brand on the point of the shoulder, Bart Ruiz put his stove-up hand flat on the table and bowed his silver head and was quiet a long time. He had helped foal that colt. He had been there in the blizzard, had ridden the breaks that month beside her father looking, had been the one at last to tell old Tom gently that a horse a month gone in that country was a horse to grieve. And all this time, the old man said finally, his voice not quite steady, all this time, El Grulo, the finest stud I have seen in 70 years, the horse I have watched 3 summers and called a wonder of the wild country. He is Tom Smoke. He has been Tom Smoke the whole time, and I did not know my own hands raising, because the wild made him greater than we dared to breed him. Bart looked up at Cora then, with something fierce come into his tired eyes. Your father did not fail, he said. He is standing out there in the breaks tonight, the thing your father died thinking he never made, and these men want to put poison in his water for $10 a head. She went out to the band the next evening, carrying the knowing like a lamp she had to keep from spilling. Nothing was different. And everything was, and the storm-gray stallion could not have said why the woman who came slow across his tolerated ground that gold evening had a new thing in her that he read at once, the way horses read the things people cannot hide. She came to his head and laid her open hand on the storm-colored neck, and this time she let herself say the name aloud, low, over and over. The name her father had given a foal 5 winters and a whole wild life ago. Smoke. And whether it was the name or the summer's long patience come to its ripeness, or only the wind sitting right, the great horse dropped his head and breathed against her shoulder, and stood and let her be there in a way he had not before, so that Cora Halloran wept for the second time that week with her face in the mane of her father's last living work and was not ashamed. She had come out meaning to study a strategy. She stayed because for a little while, in the level gold light with the band drowsing at the water, the whole hard summer let go of her, and there was only the warm-breathing horse and the old free country and the sense, strong as she had felt anything since her father died, that old Tom was somehow standing just behind her left shoulder, where he always used to stand when she worked a colt, saying nothing, letting her find it herself, the way he always had. Bart told her the rest of the colt's story over the next nights, the parts she had been too green to hold when they happened, and the telling was the old man's way of grieving and of hoping at once. How Tom had sat up 3 nights with the newborn gray when a lesser man would have slept. How he had turned down a fat offer for the colt from a horseman 2 territories over, laughing, saying the horse was not for sale because the horse was not really his, that a horse like that only lets you keep it a while for the country. How after the blizzard, after the month of looking, her father had never once said the word dead about that colt, had only stopped saddling to go and look, and had carried the not saying to his own last evening in the chair by the stove. Bart believed he told her, that some part of Tom Holleran had always known the gray was alive out there in the breaks, and had chosen not to gather him, not to break him back to a corral and a brand and a bill of sale, because the old man had come by the end of his life to a notion most cattlemen would have called foolish, that the finest thing he ever made was finer for being free, and that you could own a horse or you could let it be the best horse in the country, but past a certain point you could not do both. It was not a practical way to think. It had helped mortgage the place into the danger it now stood in. And it was, Cora understood, sitting in the lamplight with the old vaquero, exactly the thing in her father she had loved past all sense, and exactly the thing she had inherited whole. Because here she sat, one payment from the auction block, spending herself down to nothing to keep a band of horses free that she could have caught and sold to clear her note in a week. And that was the night she settled the last thing, the thing she had been circling since the wolfer asked his flat question at the rack. She would not gather the band to save it. It would have been the practical course, the course a sensible outfit would take. To run the whole bunch into a canyon trap while there was time, brand them, call them diamond stock by the lawful right of the iron already on their leader, and put them behind poles where no poison spring could reach them. It would even have been a kind of saving. But it would have been the saving that killed the thing worth saving. The free wild soundness that was the whole of what her father had loved and the whole of what made them what they were, and Cora found she could no more do it than she could have roped the wind. She would keep them free and keep them alive both, or she would fail at a thing worth failing at. She would stand between the band and the poison at the water itself, in the open, on the wild ground. And she would break the men behind it in the daylight, and she would leave the storm gray stallion free on the western range at the end of it, with his band around him, because that was the only ending her father would have recognized as winning. It was the harder road by every measure. Bart, who knew her, did not argue it. He only nodded slowly in the lamplight and said that Tom would have chosen the same, and that it was a poor kind of sense that saved a horse by making it into money, and that he was too old a man to start keeping the poor kind of sense now. It changed the shape of the fight for Cora, that knowing, though it changed none of the facts. The water filing was still legal on its face, the petition still stood on file, the poison still waited somewhere in the near future in a wolfer's saddlebag. But the fight was no longer only about a wild band and a right thing and a woman's stubborn conscience. It was about her father now, about the great gray work of his life run free in the western country, about the diamond blood the association meant to poison out of the basin under the lie that it was vermin. And it gave her. In the cold hours before dawn, as she sat at the table with Bart and the papers and the guttering lamp, the first true edge of a plan, because she saw now what the papers had not quite given her, and what the honest men of the basin would not be able to look away from. It was one thing to declare a band of nameless wild horses vermin and poison the water they drank. It was another thing entirely, in a cattle country that lived and died by the sanctity of a brand, to be shown that the vermin the great Harlan Rook wanted poisoned were blooded horses carrying a registered diamond iron, the lawful property, lost but never abandoned, never sold, never disclaimed, of the Halloran outfit. You could poison vermin and call it range management. You could not poison another outfit's branded horses and call it anything but what it was, and every cattleman in the basin, honest or not, knew in his bones which of those two things the whole country was built on protecting. Rook had built his murder on the word vermin, and under the storm gray coat of the horse at the center of it, healed and hidden and provable, Cora Halloran had just found the one word that could burn Rook's whole clever scheme to the ground. A brand. A brand was proof, but proof needed an audience that could not be bought or laughed off, and that was the piece Cora still lacked. She could ride into the Ceniza Plaza and hold up her stamped copies and pull the storm gray coat back from the diamond iron with her own hands. And Harlan Rook would stand on the mercantile porch with his gold watch chain across his belly, and his voice used to being obeyed, and tell the town that a desperate woman would say anything and burn any old brand into a wild horse to save her failing outfit, and half the basin would believe him because half the basin owed him money or feared him or simply found it easier. She needed a witness whose word on a horse no man in the territory could wave away. Someone with standing and authority and, above all, an eye for horseflesh that the whole country would trust against rooks. And it was Bart, turning the problem over at the table across the long nights, who remembered the army. The cavalry bought horses. It had always bought horses, and in that dry year it was buying hard, because a remount officer had come down to Fort Sable on the territory's northern edge with a board and a warrant and gold to spend, tasked with buying sound saddle stock for the mounted service. And the word had gone through the horse country that the army was paying in coin for good using horses at a time when no rancher in the basin could give a horse away for paper. The officer's name was Alden Frost, Captain Alden Frost, and the men who had dealt with him at Fort Sable said he was a spare, upright cavalry officer with a clipped iron gray beard and a horseman's unhurried eye, that he could not be flattered or hurried or sold a bad horse dressed up as a good one, and that he had turned down whole strings of pretty, soft grain-fed animals that would founder on a hard campaign and paid top gold for plain tough, using horses with good feet and good bottom and no quit in them. He was, in other words, exactly the eye Cora needed, a man whose whole profession was telling the difference between a horse that looked like something and a horse that was something, and a man whose word, spoken in a Sinisa plaza, would carry the weight of the United States behind it. She rode to Fort Sable because everything now was long rides she could not afford on errands she could not skip, and she got in to see Captain Frost by the plain force of not leaving, sitting the bench outside the post headquarters from dawn until the captain, worn down by her patience or curious about it, had her shown in. He heard her out with a cavalryman's flat courtesy, a woman from a failing basin outfit with a wild story about a poisoned spring, and a land grab, and a band of vermin Mustangs that were secretly the finest saddle stock in the territory. And Cora could see him setting the story aside even as he listened, filing her under the long list of desperate people with wild stories that a man with gold to spend learns to expect. So she stopped selling him the story and gave him the one thing a horseman cannot set aside. She told him she would not ask him to believe a word she had said. She asked only that he ride 2 days south with her, at the army's convenience, and stand on a certain rise in the last hour of a certain day, and look through his own glasses at a certain band of horses coming down to water, and then tell her, as a professional, what he saw. If he saw vermin, she said, she would ride home and trouble him no further. If he saw what she saw, they would talk. A man who trusts his own eye above all things cannot easily refuse an invitation to use it. And Captain Frost, against his better judgment, and because the buying was slow and the story nagged at him, agreed to ride south and look. He looked from the far rise at golden hour, through a good army glass, and Cora watched his face instead of the band, because she had seen the band 100 times and had never once seen a horseman see it for the first time. She watched Captain Alden Frost go still. She watched the professional flatness leave him by degrees as the wild band came down out of the breaks through the level gold light, 30-odd head fat and sound in the third year of a drought that had every grain-fed horse in the basin drawn up gaunt, moving in that loose free line, the mares and their leggy foals, and last and highest the storm-gray stud on his rise. Storm colored against the burning sky, testing the wind, the black mane lifting, the whole band taking its ease from him. She watched a man who bought horses for a living forget for a moment that he was there to appraise anything. When Frost finally lowered the glass, his voice had changed, and what he said was not a captain's careful words, but a horseman's plain ones. "In 30 years," he said, "I have not seen a better-footed, harder-bottom band of horses stand on any range, and that gray is the best stud horse I have ever put a glass on, bar none." Then the officer came back into him, and he turned to Cora with a new sharpness and asked the question that meant she had won the first round. "Those are not scrub," he said. "Where in God's name did wild horses get blood like that?" So she told him the rest, and now he listened as a man listens, who has seen the thing with his own eye and needs the story to explain it. And it all fit. The mortgaged Spanish stud and the blooded mare and the lost gray colt and the killing blizzard 5 winters gone. The band built out of diamond blood run free. The diamond iron she had felt with her own fingers healed into the storm gray shoulder. And she laid the stamped copies of the land record in his hands. The water filing dated months before the bounty, the petition with its bloodless line about the treatment of shared waters, and she watched Captain Frost read the murder written out in the murderer's own hand and go pale and quiet the way honest men go when they are shown a thing that dishonest men have carefully arranged. He understood horses, and understanding horses he understood at last exactly what was being proposed. That the soundest band of saddle stock in the territory, blood the army would pay a fortune to breed from, was to be poisoned at its water like rats in a granary, so that one greedy man could steal a basin, and something in the upright cavalry officer took personal offense at it. Professional offense. The offense of a man who had spent his life valuing horses being shown men who valued them at $10 a head of strychnine. He did not make a speech. He only folded the papers, handed them back, and said that he would need to see the brand himself, up close and certain, before he would put the army's word behind any of it, and that if the brand was what she said it was, he would stand on any rise or in any plaza she named and say so to any man in the territory, Harlan Rook included. It was, Cora thought, the first time in the whole summer that anyone with power in the world had offered to stand in front of the thing beside her instead of behind it, and she had to look away at the darkening breaks a moment before she could thank him. But Rook was not waiting, and the days Cora spent riding to Fort Sable and back with a cavalry captain had been days Harlan Rook spent closing his hand. She came home to find the country tightened another notch. Pettibone had sent a rider out to the Diamond with a letter, careful and sorrowful as the man himself, informing her that the bank found itself obliged to call her note 30 days early, that circumstances beyond his control required it, and Cora did not need to be told whose circumstances or whose control. Rook meant to have the ground under her before she could make trouble with it, to turn her from a landowner withstanding into a dispossessed woman with a grievance, which the country would find far easier to ignore. And worse than the note, far worse, was what Bart had seen on the Western Line while she was gone. Creel had built something at the head of Ojo Frio, a little brush blind of piled cedar, the kind a wolfer builds to work from unseen, set on the rock shelf above the spring where the water rose, positioned exactly where a man would want to be positioned to do a quiet, careful job on the water at the hour of his choosing. He had not done it yet. The blind sat empty, waiting, a patient workman's preparation, and its emptiness was a clock. Creel would come to the spring soon, in the dark before some dawn, and do the thing he had built the blind to do, and the storm gray band would come down through the gold light of that same evening to drink at the water as they had drunk all their lives, and whatever Cora Halloran meant to do to stand between them and it, she now had days to do it in, and maybe not even days. She made her plan that night with Bart, and it was thin and dangerous, and it was all she had. Frost had to see the brand, and to see the brand he had to get close to the gray, and only Cora could bring anyone close to the gray, and even she was not sure the stallion would suffer a stranger near enough for a captain to read a healed brand in daylight. That was the first gamble. The second was the timing, because the whole thing turned on catching Rook and Creel in the act, on having the honest men of the basin and the cavalry captain, and Cora Prade, the territorial marshal, all standing at Ojo Frio, at the very hour the wolfer came to poison it, so that the plan and the proof and the crime would all be in one place at one time, and no smooth voice on a porch could talk it into fog. She could not simply announce a poisoning she could not yet prove was coming. She had to draw it, to make Rook and Creel move at a time and place of her choosing rather than theirs, and to have her witnesses waiting when they did. And the only bait she had for a trap like that, the only thing that would bring Harlan Rook himself out to the western country to see a job done that he had been careful to keep his soft hands off of, was the one card she had not yet played, and could only play once. She would have to let Rook know that she knew. She would have to make the theft of the basin feel, to the man stealing it, suddenly and personally unsafe to leave one more day, so that he would send his wolfer to the water now, on Cora's clock, into a plaza of waiting eyes he did not know were there. It was, Bart said, looking at her across the guttering lamp, a plan that put her own body at the center of it as the bait, and Cora said yes, she knew, and that her father had told her a person's whole worth came down to what they would stand in front of, and that she had found the thing, and that she was going to stand in front of it. And would Bart help her? And the old vaquero looked at Thomas Halloran's stubborn air, a long moment in the lamplight, and reached across and gripped her hand, and said that he had been helping Halloran stand in front of things since before she was foaled, and did not intend to stop at the last and best of them. Getting Captain Frost close enough to read the brand was the first and finest gamble, and it went the way only the true things go, which is to say, it nearly did not, and then did. Cora brought the captain out at golden hour, and left him at the edge of the tolerated ground while she walked the long, slow road in alone. And the storm-gray stud, who had never in his life let two humans near him at once, stood trembling and blowing, while Cora laid her open hand on his neck and talked him down, and by the smallest degree waved the captain forward, a slow step at a time. Frost was a horseman to his marrow, and he came the way a horseman comes, low and easy and taking nothing, his eyes down, and the gray suffered it, because Cora stood at his head with her hand on him, and her voice going, and because some part of the lost diamond colt perhaps remembered, under all the wild years, that a human at his head with a low voice had once meant no harm. Frost got close enough. He looked long at the point of the storm-gray shoulder where the summer coat lay thin, and he put out one careful finger at Cora's nod, and read the healed ridge of it the way she had. And when he stepped back and let the gray have his distance again, the captain's face had the look of a man who has been shown the truth of a thing, and can no longer pretend the comfort of doubt. "That is a diamond brand," he said quietly, "on the best horse in the territory, and I will swear to it before God, the army, and the territorial court." Then he looked at the storm-gray band drifting up into the breaks against the dying gold, and he said the other thing, the horseman's thing, half to himself. "And they mean to poison it." He said it the way a man says a blasphemy he has just come to believe in. The captain's word changed the weight of everything. Frost sent an army rider to the territorial seat with a letter under his own seal, and the letter brought what no plea from a pressed basin woman could have brought. The territorial marshal, a lean, plain, unbought man named Deal, who answered to the government and not to the Rincon Cattlemen's Association, who owed Harlan Rook nothing and did not care for the smell of a cattle king filing on the last water in a drought. Frost Standing summoned him, and Cora's stamped papers held him, and the marshal agreed, warily and then grimly, as he read the petitions line about the treatment of shared waters. That if a man could be caught putting poison in a shared water, he would answer for it under territorial law, whatever paper he waved, and that a lost brand never disclaimed was still an outfit's lawful property, and that poisoning another outfit's branded horses was a crime the size of the country itself. He would come. He would bring 2 deputies. He would stand at the spring and see with his own eyes, on one condition, that Cora make certain the thing happened soon, because a marshal could not sit a week in the breaks waiting on a crime that might not come. And that put the last piece of it back in Cora's own hands. She had to make it come. The honest men of the basin were the hardest part. Harder than the captain, and harder than the marshal, because the captain and the marshal owed Rook nothing, and the honest ranchers owed him a story they had already swallowed. Cora and Frost rode 2 hard days through the western outfits before the plaza, calling on the middling men, the small and stubborn ranchers, who ran a few hundred head against the same drought, and had gone along with the bounty, because the association told them the wild horses were eating the grass and fouling the water their own cattle needed. And because it is an easy thing to believe of a creature you have decided to be rid of. Cora had learned by then not to lead with the horses. She led with the water. She sat their kitchens and laid the stamped copies on their tables, and let them read in Rook's own filing that the great man had claimed the last shared spring in the basin months before he ever spoke the word vermin. And she watched it land on them one by one, the understanding that the thing the association had sold them as pest control was the theft of the water out from under every outfit at the table, their own along with hers. The first 2 put them out. A man does not like to be shown he has been made a fool of, and the showing comes with a bill of shame he would rather not pay. And 2 of the ranchers chose the comfort of calling Cora a desperate woman, with a grievance over the discomfort of calling Harlan Rook a thief. But the 3rd was a lean, close-mouthed rancher named Ansel Merrick, who ran a hard little outfit on the South Fork and owed the latter nothing but dislike, and Merrick read the papers twice, slow, the way Cora's own father had read things, and then he got up and looked out his window at his own gaunt cattle, standing off the water they could not reach for the drought, and he said, without turning around, that he had wondered why the association was so free with a bounty when it had never once been free with anything else. Merrick came, and Merrick brought 2 more with him over the next day, plain hard men who trusted Merrick's slow judgment where they would never have trusted a pressed woman's passion, and Captain Frost sealed the last of it by telling them, in a cavalryman's flat, unarguable way, what he had seen through his own glass on the western rise, that the band was the soundest saddle stock in the territory, and that the army would swear to it, and that a country which poisoned horses like that to steal a spring was a country he was ashamed to buy remounts in. When a United States officer says he is ashamed of your basin, a certain kind of hard, honest man feels it in his spine, and by the 2nd evening Cora had her witnesses, 3 of the basin's honest, middling ranchers who would ride to the cold spring and stand along the rim and see with their own eyes whatever the dawn showed them. It was more than witnesses. It was the thing Cora had needed since the beginning and had not known how to name, which was standing. Alone, she was a failing woman with a wild story. But a woman with a cavalry captain, a territorial marshal, and 3 respected basin ranchers at her back was something else entirely, a thing the country would have to look at and could not simply wave off the porch, and she understood as she watched Ansel Merrick tighten his cinch to ride that the far fight was very nearly won already, on paper and in the sworn word of honest men, and that all that remained was to make the near fight happen where all of them could see it. The proof had to be caught in the act. The papers proved a plan. Only the poison at the water, the wolfer's hand at the spring, the great man's order given aloud, would prove the crime past any lawyer's fog, and that meant the whole careful company she had gathered would come to nothing unless she could make Rook and his wolfer move at the hour and the place of her choosing, into the ring of waiting eyes she had built. She had spent the far fight's coin. Now she had to spend her own body as the bait for the near one. And she rode back towards Sinisa knowing it, steady and afraid at once, to do the one reckless thing the whole patient summer had been building toward. So she played her one card, and she played it in the Sinisa Plaza, in the white light of noon where the whole town could watch. She rode in, tied at the public rack, and she found Harlan Rook on the mercantile porch among his men, heavy and easy in his broadcloth coat, with his gold watch chain across his belly, and she walked up to him in her faded blue prairie dress, with her level gray eyes that did not flinch, and she told him, not loudly, but plainly enough for the porch to hear, that she had been to the land office at the territorial seat, that she had read his filing on the water at Ojo Frio and his petition about the treatment of shared waters, that she had found on the wild band a horse carrying a lawful diamond brand her father had never disclaimed, and that she was carrying stamped copies of all of it to the territorial court, and that she meant to see him answer for what the papers plainly showed he had planned. She watched the smooth, easy face across from her do the thing she had ridden a day to make it do. She watched Harlan Rook understand that the pressed woman he had counted, as good as sold, was standing in the public plaza with the whole of his clever murder in her saddlebag, and a witness and a purpose. And she watched the arithmetic run behind his flat eyes, the same arithmetic she had counted on, that a scheme built on the word vermin could not survive a branded horse and a court, that the living proof of the whole fraud was a storm-gray stud out in the breaks, and that living proof could still, for a few days more, be made to simply disappear at its water before any court ever convened. She had not proved the poisoning. She had done something more useful. She had made the poisoning, in Harlan Rook's mind, suddenly and urgently necessary, and she had set his clock to run against her court, and she had let him believe he still had the days he needed and the secrecy he had always had. Rook recovered his smile and told the porch that grief had unsettled Thomas Halloran's heir, that everyone should pity her, and Cora let him say it and rode home, because the insult meant she had won. A man does not trouble to call you mad in a public plaza unless he has just decided he must move against you fast. He moved that same night, exactly as she had bet her father's whole legacy that he would. Bart, watching the western line from the dark of the breaks, saw the wolfer come. Silas Creel rode up to the head of Ojo Frio in the black hours before dawn on his hard-mouthed dun, a canvas sack tied behind his saddle, and put his horse in the cedar blind he had built, and settled to wait for the gray light that would let him do careful work on the water before the band came down at evening to drink it. He did not know that the pressed woman had reached the spring before him in the last of the dark, and taken her place on the rock shelf between the cedar blind and the pool, in her faded blue prairie dress, with her father's rifle across her arm, and no intention on God's earth of using it. He did not know that a cavalry captain and a territorial marshal and 2 deputies and 3 of the basin's honest middling ranchers, men Cora and Frost had ridden 2 hard days to reach and to show the stamped papers, lay hidden along the rim of the breaks above the spring in the graying dark, waiting. And Harlan Rook, riding out himself in the cold before dawn to see with his own soft eyes the last obstacle to his basin removed, because a man who trusts no one trusts least of all a hired wolfer with the most important job of his life, did not know any of it either. All of them came down to Ojo Frio in the last dark of that morning, for their own reasons, the wolfer to poison it, the cattle king to watch it done, the woman to stand in front of it, and the law and the army and the honest men to see which of the 3 the dawn would prove right. And over the whole of the western basin, for the first time in 3 dry years, the sky had gone black from rim to rim with cloud, the great storm that had been gathering unspent all season stacked at last into towers that swallowed the stars. And the first far mutter of thunder rolled down off the Rincon breaks like the country itself clearing its throat to speak. The gray light came up under the black sky, and Silas Creel came out of his cedar blind with the canvas sack in his hand, and found Cora Halloran standing between him and the water. She stood on the rock shelf at the head of Ojo Frio in her faded blue prairie dress. Her father's rifle held low and unraised across her arm, her level gray eyes on his flat pale ones, and she did not point the gun at him, because she had not come to shoot a man and would not have, and a raised gun on that shelf would have made her only one more killer in a morning that had too many already. She spoke to him instead, low and steady in the gentling voice, the voice with no fear in it, and she told him the truth she had bet everything he was still man enough to hear. That the band he had been paid to poison was no wild scrub, that the storm gray stud was a blooded horse carrying a lawful diamond brand, her father's iron, lost in a blizzard and never disclaimed. That the water he meant to foul watered half the honest outfits in the basin, and that the whole bounty was a lie a rich man had built to steal a country, and that Silas Creel, whatever he had let himself become, had once been a horseman, and no horseman who had ever gentled a colt or trusted his life to a good horse under him in bad country could stand on this rock in the gray dawn and put poison in the water of the best band of horses in the territory. Not for $10 a head, not for all Harlan Rook's gold, not and still call himself a man who knew horses. And then, because the country itself seemed to have decided to testify, the storm gray band came down. They came early, driven ahead of the breaking storm the way horses come ahead of weather, down out of the breaks through the wild gray light, with the thunder walking behind them, and the stud came at their head, and then broke from them, and came on alone to the shelf above the spring, where his summer's one human stood. And he stopped a few lengths off with the storm in his mane and his great dark eye rolling white at the wolfer and the strangeness, and he did not run, because Cora lifted her open hand to him, slow, at the end of her still arm, the way she had lifted it 1,000 times. And the storm-gray stallion held his ground between the woman and his band, with the first fat drops of the broken drought striking the red rock around them like the country coming to life. Silas Creel stood on the shelf with the canvas sack in his hand and looked at the branded stud he had been paid to end, storm-colored and unbroken in the rising light, with a woman's open hand held out to him, and something in the wolfer's flat pale eyes came apart. He was a hard man and a killer of wild things for wages, but he had told the truth about one thing at the public rack in Siniza without knowing it was truth. He knew horses, had known them all his life, had come to killing them only the long, slow way a man comes to any ruin. And the horseman in Silas Creel, buried under years of wolf bounties and cold indifference, looked at El Grullo in the stormlight and would not let his hand open the sack. He lowered it. He stood a long moment with the rain coming harder, and then he set the canvas sack down on the rock, away from the water, and stepped back from it, and said, in a voice like something rusted turning for the first time in years, that he had poisoned his last water, and that no wage was worth being the man who put out that horse. Harlan Rook rode up out of the dawn to find his whole basin coming down around him. He had come to watch his obstacle removed, and he found instead his wolfer standing back from an unopened sack, the branded stud alive in the rain, the pressed woman with her hand raised and her rifle unfired, and he did what such men do when the arithmetic finally turns against them. He lost the smooth voice and showed the thing underneath. He swore at Creel and ordered the job done, ordered the sack opened and the water fouled and the horses finished, shouted that he had paid for it and would have it, that the band was vermin declared by lawful petition, and he would see every head of it dead in the water before he let a failing woman and a broke wolfer cost him what he had spent a year and a fortune to arrange. And it was into the middle of that shouted confession, every word of it carrying clear across the rock in the wet dawn air, that the territorial marshal rose up out of the cedar along the rim with his 2 deputies and Captain Alden Frost and 3 of the basin's honest ranchers behind him. And let Harlan Rook hear, in the sudden silence, exactly how many unbought witnesses had just listened to the head of the Rincon Cattlemen's Association order poison put into the last shared water in a drought to murder another outfit's branded horses for the theft of a basin. The marshal took him there on the rock. Frost read the brand aloud for the ranchers to see, drew back the storm-wet coat from the storm-gray shoulder with Cora at the stallion's head, and showed the honest men of the basin the diamond iron on the horse Rook had called Vermin. And the honest men, who lived and died by the sanctity of a brand, looked at it in the rain, and understood the whole of what had nearly been done in their name. And the thing was finished. The papers, the poison, the branded horse, the shouted order, the witnesses, all of it in one place at 1 hour, exactly as Cora Halloran had planned it across 100 nights at a guttering lamp. There was no smooth voice on a porch in the world that could talk that morning into fog. The storm broke over the Ceniza Basin that day and broke the drought with it. A slow, soaking 3-day rain that put the creeks to running and the grass to greening, and made a liar of every man who had said the country was finished, and it made a particular liar of the plan that had needed the drought to work, for a basin with water everywhere had no use for one man's stolen spring. And Harlan Rook's filing on Ojo Frio, like the rest of his arrangement, dissolved in the territorial court under the weight of a marshal's testimony and a captain's word and a stack of stamped public records a pressed woman had ridden 3 days to copy out by lamp. The water claim was voided as fraudulent. The petition was struck. The bounty was withdrawn in shame by an association that could not fast enough disown the thing its head had done, and Harlan Rook answered for the whole of it under territorial law and went out of the basin a broken name, which in cattle country is the one death that lasts. Silas Creel rode north to the wolf country he had come from, and what he carried out of the basin no court recorded. But Bart, who had watched him set the sack down, said a man who chooses right once at the last edge of himself has a road back, and that the wolfer had found the head of his, and Cora let it stand, because her father had taught her that you do not close the gate on a creature that has just, against its whole nature, walked back through it toward the good. And the horses the whole territory had called worthless became the salvation of the diamond, exactly and only because they had always been worth everything, and it took a cavalry captain's eye to make the basin admit what it had lain in the grass and refused to see. Captain Alden Frost bought diamond horses that fall, and the next fall, and put the Army's gold and the Army's word behind the blood of the Storm Gray Band, sound-footed, hard-bottomed, using horses with no quit in them, the finest remounts the mounted service had bought in the territory in 20 years, and where the Army bought, everyone came. The stage lines and the ranchers and the horse buyers from 3 territories. Until the plainest truth in the Ceniza Basin was that if you wanted a horse that would carry you through hard country and never fail you, you bought a diamond gray. Cora paid the note with the first year's sale and never came near it again, and she gentled the band the long, slow way, the promise-keeping way, never breaking one. And she let the storm gray stud run free at the head of them on the western range for the rest of his life, gathering his foals as they came and putting the diamond iron on them proud, the same iron that was healed and hidden under his own coat, so that the mark her father had died, believing he lost in a blizzard, came back to the basin on the best horses in the West and stayed. Bart lived to see it, and to teach her foals the things his hands knew, and to say more than once, sitting the corral rail in the evening light, that Tom Halloran had bred the horse of the country after all, and only had to die a while before it was allowed to be true. There is a picture the basin keeps of Cora Halloran, and it is the true one, the one that says the whole of it without a word. It is golden hour on the western range in a wet green year, the low sun turning the shortgrass to poured brass exactly as it had in the dry years, the light unchanged, though everything under it has turned. A tall, sun-browned woman in a faded blue prairie dress stands out on the open ground, with her flat-brimmed hat pushed back. And the storm-gray stallion stands loose and free a few lengths off, with his black mane lifting in the evening wind, and the dark stripe down his spine, and the diamond healed into his shoulder, and beyond them the wild band grazes fat and sound on saved grass at saved water, foals leggy among them, the whole free-blooded work of a dead man's life going on. And the woman lifts her open hand to the gray slow, at the end of a still arm, the way she has 10,000 times, asking nothing and offering nothing but the promise kept. And the storm-colored horse that belongs to nobody and trusts one human on the earth swings his great head and comes to her hand through the brass-colored light. Her father used to say the prairie gave you dust with one hand, and once in a life, if you were the kind that stood in front of things, a diamond with the other. He had found the water and named the ranch for that saying long before Cora was old enough to understand it. She understood it now. She had stood in front of the thing that was only right, with nothing but a faded dress and an open hand and the truth copied out by lamp, and the country that had waited to watch her sold had come around at last to calling her horses the pride of the territory. Dust in one hand. In the other, standing storm-colored against the burning sky, where the last free water still ran, the diamond. And the low sun poured its brass across the saved grass, and the wild band grazed on into the evening of the good years, and there was no bounty on any head of it, and there never would be again.